You've heard of the Trail of Tears, but there was another forced march in American history that most people have never heard of. In 1838, hundreds of Potawatomi men, women, and children were forced from their homes at gunpoint. What followed was a long and brutal journey across hundreds of miles of the American frontier. Many never made it to the end. Those who survived gave this tragedy a name: the Potawatomi Trail of Death. And this is where their story begins. The Potawatomi, whose name means keepers of the fire, were one of the most important nations in the Great Lakes region of North America. Their homeland stretched across what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, a landscape of dense forests, clear rivers, and the vast waters of the Great Lakes. Rich, beautiful, extraordinarily abundant. The Potawatomi were not wanderers. They were settled, sophisticated people with permanent villages, complex social structures, and deep roots in the land they called home. They grew corn, beans, and squash in fields cultivated for generations. They fished the rivers and lakes. They hunted deer and elk in the vast surrounding forests. But their greatest strength was their political intelligence. The Potawatomi were founding members of the Council of Three Fires, a powerful alliance with the Ojibwe and Ottawa nations that dominated the Great Lakes region for centuries. This was not simply a military alliance. It was a sophisticated political and cultural confederation with shared ceremonies, shared responsibilities, and shared decision-making processes. Together, the Three Fires nations were one of the most formidable political forces in North America. No European power could establish itself in the Great Lakes without their cooperation. When the French arrived in the 1600s, the Potawatomi built alliances with the French, trading furs and gaining access to European goods and weapons. When the British pushed out the French, the Potawatomi adapted, building new alliances while maintaining their own independence. During the American Revolution, most Potawatomi bands sided with the British, correctly recognizing that an American victory would bring an unstoppable wave of settlers into their territory. They were absolutely right, but it didn't save them. After the American Revolution, the United States began its relentless push into Potawatomi territory. Between 1789 and 1833, the Potawatomi signed over 40 separate treaties with the United States government. 40 treaties in less than 50 years. Each one took more land. Each one promised that what remained would be theirs forever. Each one was eventually broken or reinterpreted to take even more. By the early 1830s, the Potawatomi had been pushed back into a fraction of their original territory. Their lands in Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and most of Indiana were gone. And then Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, ordering all Native American nations east of the Mississippi to relocate west. For the Cherokee, it became the Trail of Tears. Thousands died. For the Creek, forced removal. Thousands died. For the Choctaw, forced removal. Thousands died. The Potawatomi resisted. They negotiated. They appealed to U.S. courts. They hired lawyers. They wrote letters to Congress. They converted to Christianity, believing it would protect them. They built farms, schools, and churches, demonstrating by every standard the U.S. government claimed to value that they were assimilated and peaceful. None of it mattered. One group in particular refused to leave. A band of approximately 859 Potawatomi near Twin Lakes in northern Indiana, led by their Chief Menominee. They had built a thriving community. They had a Catholic mission. Their children attended school. Their farms produced abundant harvests. Chief Menominee had signed no removal treaty. He refused to sign any removal treaty. "The president does not know the truth," Menominee said. "He has been deceived. I have not sold my lands. I will not sell them." Indiana Governor David Wallace had a different view.
In the summer of 1838, he ordered the forcible removal of all remaining Potawatomi from Indiana. He sent in the state militia. The Trail of Death, 660 miles. On August 30th, 1838, soldiers arrived at the Potawatomi villages near Twin Lakes. They were given almost no warning, almost no time to prepare. Families were separated from their belongings. Homes were burned behind them as they watched. Crops that had been carefully tended through the summer were destroyed. Cattle and horses were seized. 859 Potawatomi were assembled at gunpoint. Chief Menominee was arrested before the march began, taken away in chains to be transported separately to Kansas under military guard. And then the rest were told to march. The march began in the brutal heat of late August. The column of nearly 800 people, men, women, children, infants, and elders, stretched along the road heading west. Almost immediately, people began to fall ill. Cholera swept through the marching column in the early weeks, moving from family to family, killing indiscriminately. Children and elders were the most vulnerable. The heat was merciless, the water was scarce and often contaminated. The food was insufficient. People died, and the soldiers pushed the column forward regardless. There was no time to mourn properly, no time to give the dead a decent burial. Families were forced to leave behind the bodies of their loved ones in hastily dug graves along the side of the road, unmarked, in land they would never see again. A Catholic priest named Father Benjamin Marie Petit accompanied the march. He had served the Potawatomi Mission at Twin Lakes and refused to abandon his congregation. He kept detailed written records of everything he witnessed, records that historians today provide the most complete account we have of what happened on the Trail of Death. Father Petit wrote of children dying along the road. He wrote of elders collapsing from exhaustion and disease. He wrote of the grief that hung over the column, grief for the dead, grief for the home they had been torn from, grief for a future that seemed impossible to imagine. But he wrote of something else. He wrote of the extraordinary dignity with which the Potawatomi faced what was being done to them, of their prayers, of the way they cared for each other, sharing what little food and water they had, carrying those who could no longer walk, refusing to abandon anyone who needed help. They walk with a firmness and resignation worthy of the Christian faith they profess, Father Petit wrote. The march covered 660 miles in approximately 40 days, through Indiana, through Illinois, across Missouri, into the prairies of eastern Kansas. By the time they arrived, at least 42 people were confirmed dead. Many historians believe the true number was significantly higher. Deaths that occurred in the weeks after arrival from illnesses contracted on the road were not included in the official toll. Of the 859 who began the march, fewer than 820 survived. The survivors named it themselves, Potawatomi Trail of Death.
Back in Indiana, the land the Potawatomi had been forced from was immediately occupied. Their farms were taken by white settlers, their homes were lived in by people who had watched them be marched away at gunpoint. Their sacred sites were plowed under. The Twin Lakes near their village, which the Potawatomi had fished and revered for generations, were eventually drained entirely to create farmland. Every physical trace of the Potawatomi presence in northern Indiana was systematically erased. Chief Menominee arrived in Kansas in chains. He looked at the flat, dry, unfamiliar land he had been brought to, so different from the forests and lakes of his homeland, and never accepted what had been done. He continued to insist that the removal had been illegal, that he had never signed a treaty, that his land had been stolen. Chief Menominee died in Kansas in 1841. He was approximately 60 years old. He never returned to Indiana. He never saw his homeland again. But the Potawatomi were not erased.
Today, there are multiple federally recognized Potawatomi nations across the United States and Canada. The citizen Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma, one of the largest federally recognized tribes in the United States, with over 36,000 enrolled members. A sovereign nation with its own government, its own businesses, and its own schools. The Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation in Kansas, the direct descendants of the survivors of the Trail of Death, still living on the same land where their exhausted, grieving ancestors arrived in the fall of 1838. They turned that land into a home. They built a community. They survived. The Forest County Potawatomi in Wisconsin, the Hannahville Potawatomi in Michigan, the Pokagon Band in Indiana and Michigan, who never left the Great Lakes region at all, having negotiated a separate arrangement allowing a small group to remain. Their language, Bodeawadminwen, was nearly extinct by the late 19th century. Today, it is being actively revived. Language classes are held in communities across the country. Young Potawatomi are learning the words their grandparents were punished for speaking. Every year, descendants of the Trail of Death survivors make a commemorative walk along the route of the march. They retrace the steps of their ancestors, 660 miles, the same road, the same towns, to honor the dead, to remember what was done, and to refuse to let history be buried. They walk, not in defeat, in remembrance, in dignity, in defiance, because the Potawatomi have always been the keepers of the fire, and that fire, through everything, has never gone out. The Trail of Tears is taught in American schools. Monuments have been built. Books have been written. The Trail of Death is not taught. It has no monuments. Most Americans have never heard of it. 859 people were forced from their homes at gunpoint. Children died on the road. Elders died on the road. Families were torn apart. A community was destroyed. And for nearly 2 centuries, their story was buried. That ends here. If this story moved you, share this video so more people can know the truth about the Potawatomi Nation. Follow the page for more untold stories of Native American history. And tell me in the comments, which Native American tribe do you want to see next?